14 months. 14 months Emma Carter had existed as a ghost in Dominic Castellano's mansion. Her hands polished surfaces gleaming under chandeliers she could never afford, folded towels softer than anything she had ever slept on, arranged flowers that cost more than her monthly rent. The mansion sprawled across 4 floors of Manhattan luxury, all marble and black oak and windows overlooking a city where she could barely afford a cramped corner. Dominic Castellano was a shadow she had learned to predict. Hearing his footsteps on the stairs, heavy, deliberate, she knew to disappear elsewhere. Glimpsing him through doorways, dark hair, a faint scar on his left jaw, expensive suits that seemed born on him, gray eyes like storms that never once landed on her. Her job was to vanish, and she was very good at vanishing. $118,000 in debt does not vanish on its own. Her mother had died 3 years ago from lung cancer, the disease gnawing at her body for 18 months while swallowing every penny of their savings. $73,000 in hospital bills still arrived regularly after the funeral. Reminders that even death has a price. Then, 6 months ago, a truck running a red light at 3 in the morning had stolen Noah's legs. Her 19-year-old brother, a college freshman, now sat in a wheelchair in their crumbling studio apartment in South Bronx, trying to do physical therapy through YouTube videos because they could not afford a specialist. Another $45,000. Emma signed payment plans that would follow her into her 40s, accepted interest rates that should have been illegal, learned to survive on cheap coffee and cheaper hope. She worked 3 jobs. 5 in the morning she woke, 6 she arrived at the Castellano mansion, 3 in the afternoon she returned home to care for Noah, 6 in the evening she went to the bar until midnight. Saturdays and Sundays she added office cleaning shifts. She slept on the subway, ate leftovers from the bar, drank coffee instead of breakfast and lunch. 4 hours of sleep each night if she was lucky. Her body ran on caffeine and guilt. Guilt for not earning enough, guilt for not being with Noah more, guilt for still being alive while her mother was dead and her brother could no longer walk. That Thursday night, the grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 8 as Emma finished wiping down the banister. November in New York meant darkness fell early and cold cut to the bone. Through the tall windows, she watched rain begin to streak the glass. Lucia, Dominic's sister who managed the kitchen, invited her to stay for dinner. Emma declined. She had a bar shift at 9. She pulled her hood up against the rain and started walking. 4 blocks. Just 4 blocks from the Castellano mansion to the subway station. She had walked it hundreds of times. This neighborhood was supposed to be safe. This was Dominic's territory. But tonight, the street was quieter than usual. Most storefronts had closed, only security lights painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. Her shoes splashed through puddles, soaking through to her socks. She kept her head down, too exhausted to stay alert, feet moving mechanically, mind blank. The alley appeared on her left, narrow and dark between 2 buildings. She had passed it 1,000 times without thought. But tonight, 2 figures stepped out from the shadows, blocking the sidewalk ahead. Emma stopped, heart hammering against her ribs. "Good evening," one of them said, thick Eastern European accent, shaved head, a snake tattoo on his wrist visible beneath his sleeve. His companion was taller, broader, silent. Emma tried to step around them, but the first man shifted, blocking her path. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" "Home." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Let me pass." The man smiled, but it was not friendly. "Just need your bag and phone." "Nice and easy." Emma handed over everything. She was too tired and too accustomed to loss to resist. But then his eyes landed on her shirt. Her cleaning uniform visible where her jacket hung open. A simple gray polo with the mansion's discreet logo embroidered on the chest. He stepped closer, rain plastered to his face. "You work for Castellano." Fear spiked ice cold through her veins. "I am just a cleaner. I do not know anything." The man looked at his companion, teeth bared in a grin. "Kozlov will like this. We have a gift for the Italian." The first punch came from nowhere, catching her across the cheekbone, pain exploding white-hot behind her eyes. Emma staggered backward. Before she could recover, hands grabbed her arms, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. She tried to scream, but a palm clamped over her mouth. "This is what happens," the first man said close to her ear. "When Castellano thinks he owns this city." The second hit caught her ribs, then another and another. Emma stopped counting after the 4th, stopped trying to fight. In her mind, there was only one thought: Noah. Her brother was waiting at home. He would have no one if she died here. Someone grabbed her hair, yanked her head back, and she saw the fist coming toward her face before everything went black. Emma lay there in the rain and the darkness, unaware that her life was about to change forever, the weight of everything she had endured pressing against her chest like a quiet, relentless ache. Yet before we follow her deeper into this moment, if you can feel the pulse of this story, if you can sense the pain Emma is carrying with every breath, take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the kind of story that reaches straight into the heart each and every day. And know that a single like or a simple share from you will help Emma's story find its way to more people who may need to hear it. And tell me, where are you listening from? Perhaps some distant city somewhere in the world, a place whose lights or shadows shape your own memories. And leave a comment below so we can see just how far this story has traveled. Now let us return to the moment when Dominic Castellano, for the very first time, truly saw the girl who had always remained invisible inside his own mansion. Marco Vitale drove slowly through the rain-soaked streets, the headlights sweeping across each alley the way they always did at this hour, steady and practiced after more than 2 decades of serving the Castellano family, and at 42 he knew this territory the way a man knows the lines on his own palms. Every corner, every alley, every shadow that should not have been there, and tonight was no different from any other night, until the beam of his lights fell upon something lying motionless on the wet ground in an alley 4 blocks from the mansion. Marco hit the brakes, his eyes narrowing as the shape clarified into a person. A woman sprawled face down with her long hair spilling over her shoulders, her clothes drenched, her body so still she looked dead. He drew his gun and stepped out of the car, scanning the darkness for signs of an ambush. But there was nothing, only rain and shadow and the silent form before him. He approached, nudged her gently with the tip of his shoe, and rolled her onto her back. Her face was grotesquely swollen, blood leaking from her mouth and nose, her left eye bruised nearly shut. But what made him pause was the gray polo shirt she wore with the familiar logo over the chest, the insignia of the Castellano estate. He knew this girl, the house cleaner who had worked there for more than a year, quiet, diligent, always lowering her gaze and avoiding eye contact with everyone. Marco knelt, pressed 2 fingers to her neck, and felt a faint but present pulse. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number he knew better than any other. Dominic answered on the second ring. "Boss," Marco said, his voice low and urgent. "I found one of ours, the cleaning girl, beaten badly." 3 seconds of silence stretched across the line. "Is she alive?" "Yes, but she needs a doctor." "Bring her here." No hospitals, for hospitals meant police and paperwork, and questions and complications their world could not afford. Marco understood. He slid one arm beneath Emma's back and the other beneath her legs, lifting her the way a man would lift a child, and she was so light it made him frown, as if there were nothing inside her but bone and exhaustion. He placed her in the back seat, draped his coat over her trembling body, and drove toward the mansion as fast as he could without drawing attention. Halfway there, Emma stirred, her eyelids fluttering open just enough to glimpse the blurred ceiling above her, the streaking streetlights, the silhouette of the man at the wheel. She attempted to speak but managed only a broken moan, and then one word slipped out, thin and desperate. Noah, her brother's name, the only thing strong enough to force itself through her pain before darkness pulled her under again. Marco glanced at her through the rearview mirror, saw her collapse back into unconsciousness, and pressed harder on the accelerator. When the car stopped before the mansion gates, Dominic was already waiting on the front steps, still in his work suit at 11 at night with his tie loosened but his expression unchanging, though his eyes sharpened like steel as Marco opened the door and lifted Emma into his arms. Dominic stepped forward, and for the first time in 14 months, he truly looked at the girl who had existed like a ghost in his home. Her face disfigured with swelling, her lips cracked and bleeding, dried blood smeared across her skin, her clothes torn and filthy, and she looked as if she had crawled out of hell itself. Who did this? Dominic's voice was low and deliberate, but Marco could hear the fury simmering beneath the calm, a kind of anger he had never heard from him in 20 years. "Do not know yet, boss," he said. "I found her in the alley, no one else in sight." Dominic nodded once and turned toward the house. "Take her to the second-floor sitting room, call Dr. Chen immediately. And Marco," he added, pausing in the doorway to look back over his shoulder, "I want to know who did this before the sun comes up." Emma recognized the light before anything else, not the weak, a flickering glow of the fluorescent bulb in her shabby apartment, but a warm and gentle radiance spilling from a crystal chandelier high above her, and she blinked hard, struggling to gather her senses while everything around her blurred, as though she were seeing it through a dirty pane of glass. The ivory ceiling carved with delicate patterns, the heavy velvet curtains in deep blue, the faint scent of oak and lilies drifting in the air. and she wondered where she was as she tried to sit up, only for a tearing pain to rip through her ribs and force a cry from her lips before she collapsed again. A hand, steady yet careful, settled on her shoulder. "Do not move," a man's voice said, low and calm with an unmistakable Asian cadence. "You have 2 broken ribs, and moving will only make the injury worse." Emma turned her head, wincing as a sharp ache pulsed along her neck, and saw a man of about 50 sitting beside the bed, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, gold-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, a stethoscope in his hand, his white shirt and tailored trousers so immaculate he looked as though he had stepped out of a private clinic in the Upper East Side. "I am Dr. Chen," he said as he gently took her wrist to check her pulse. "You were attacked. You are at the Castellano estate now, and you are safe." The words spun inside her like a storm. Castellano estate. She was lying in her employer's home on a bed that probably cost more than she made in half a year. "Doctor," Chen continued examining her, his practiced hands moving lightly but precisely over her body, checking her head, shining a small light into her eyes, pressing along her ribs until her jaw clenched in pain. "Aside from the 2 fractured ribs," he said in a tone as even as if he were reading a medical report, "you have a mild head injury, extensive bruising across the abdomen and back, a torn lip, swelling around the left eye, and no internal bleeding, which is fortunate, but you will need at least 2 weeks of rest." Fortunate. Emma almost laughed, though she knew it would feel like being ripped open, because what luck was there in lying here broken while Noah was alone at home, not knowing whether his sister was dead or alive. "My brother," she whispered, her voice rough and scraped raw. "My brother is home alone. I need to go back. You were informed that you will remain here until you recover." The new voice came from the doorway, deep and cold as steel, and Emma turned toward it despite the pain, her heart stopping for a beat when she saw Dominic Castellano, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, dressed now in a black shirt and trousers, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, the faint scar along his left jaw sharper beneath the warm light, and his gray eyes that had never once looked at her in 14 months, were now fixed on her, not through her, not past her, but at her. She felt stripped bare beneath that gaze, even though the blanket covered her up to her throat, as if he were reading every page of her life, every debt and sleepless night and skipped meal. Dr. Chen rose and nodded to Dominic. "She needs pain medication and antibiotics," he said. "I will leave the prescriptions, and she should have someone by her side during the first 24 hours because of the head injury." He left, and Emma became aware that she was alone with Dominic Castellano, the man she had avoided for more than a year now, standing less than 10 steps away from her. He moved closer, pulled a chair beside the bed, and sat down, each motion deliberate and unhurried, as though he were trying not to frighten her. But Emma felt no fear. She was too exhausted, too hurt, and all she wanted was to know whether Noah was safe and why she was here instead of in the emergency room of a public hospital. "You have worked for me for 14 months, Dominic said, his voice not a question but a statement. 14 months you passed through the rooms of my house and I never once saw you." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes still locked on hers. Until tonight. Emma did not know how to respond to his words, for she had grown accustomed to not being seen, had survived by slipping through life unnoticed. Yet now those gray eyes were burning into her with a focus she had not felt from anyone in a very long time, and Dominic leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees as he spoke. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened tonight. Every detail, nothing left out." And Emma swallowed hard, her throat raw, forcing herself to remember, though each fragment of memory came with a sharp, slicing pain. "2 men," she began, her voice trembling. "They blocked my path in the alley 4 blocks away. At first they just wanted to rob me. I gave them my bag and my phone, but then they saw the logo on my shirt." And Dominic did not interrupt, only nodded once for her to continue. "One of them had an Eastern European accent, very thick, shaved head, and a tattoo on his wrist." She closed her eyes, seeing it again, the moment he grabbed her, his sleeve pulling back to reveal the ink, a black snake coiling around his wrist, with its head pointing toward his fingers. And when she opened her eyes, Dominic was already standing, his face still expressionless, yet his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscles twitch beneath the skin. And his gray eyes were no longer cold, they were blazing with something dark and dangerous she had never witnessed in another human being. "What did they say?" he asked, his tone still steady, but she could hear the storm raging beneath it. "They said this is what happens when Castellano thinks he owns the city. And they said a name. Kozlov," she whispered, nodding even though the motion made her dizzy. "Kozlov will enjoy this." "That is what they said. They said we have a gift for the Italian." And Dominic turned away, walking toward the window where he stood, looking out at the Manhattan night with his hands clasped behind his back, silence stretching so long Emma could hear the rain outside, the ticking of a distant clock, the uneven thud of her own heartbeat. And at last Dominic spoke. "Kozlov," his voice a low animal growl. "You do not need to know who he is. You only need to know that the men who did this will be found." And when he faced her again, she saw something in his eyes that sent a shiver through her. Not fear, but the realization that she was looking at the face of a man capable of terrible things and willing to do those terrible things because of her. "Please." Emma tried to sit up despite the agony bursting through her ribs. "My brother is alone at home. He is in a wheelchair. He cannot care for himself. I need to go to him." And Dominic stepped closer, towering over her like a dark monolith. "You are not going anywhere." "But my brother," she whispered. "He will be informed that you are safe. You cannot even walk to the door, let alone care for someone else. You will stay here until Dr. Chen says you can leave. That is not a suggestion. That is an order." Emma wanted to argue, to shout that he had no right to keep her here, that she had her own life, her own responsibilities, that her brother was waiting, but her body betrayed her. The pain, the exhaustion, the effects of the medication settling into her veins, all pulling her downward, her eyelids heavy as stone. "Sleep," Dominic said, his voice softening only slightly. "I will take care of everything." And Emma wanted to ask how, wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to ask why a powerful man like him cared about an invisible house cleaner like her. But the darkness swallowed her before she could form the words. Emma did not know how long she had been asleep when the pain tore through her ribs and yanked her violently back into consciousness. The clock on the wall read 3 a.m, its hands cutting through the silence like a quiet accusation. She gasped for breath, cold sweat gathering on her forehead, her heartbeat stumbling in her chest, as she tried to understand the unfamiliar darkness around her, the faint strip of moonlight slipping through the curtains, the distant hush of rain against the windows, and it took her several seconds to remember where she was. The Castellano estate, the second-floor sitting room, not her cramped studio in South Bronx, and Noah was not lying in the bed beside her. Her bladder throbbed painfully, a simple human need she could not ignore, and she drew in a sharp breath, bracing herself as she shifted toward the edge of the mattress. Fire seemed to lick up her ribs, radiating across her body until she bit her lip hard enough to taste blood just to keep from crying out. Her feet touched the floor, cold even through her thin socks, and she gripped the bed frame, trying to stand, but her knees buckled instantly and she pitched forward, helpless and weightless for a terrifying heartbeat, until an arm swept around her waist and caught her before she hit the ground. Emma lifted her head, and in the dim moonlight she found Dominic's face only inches from hers. She had heard no door, no footsteps, nothing at all. It was as if he had been there the entire time, a silent guardian in the dark that she never knew she had. "Where were you planning to go?" His voice low and rough, the voice of a man who had not slept either. "The bathroom," she whispered, shame burning through her until she wanted to disappear, because she was 27 years old and could not even walk there on her own. Dominic said nothing. He simply slid one arm beneath her knees, the other behind her back, and lifted her as if she weighed no more than a pillow. And though Emma wanted to protest, to insist she could manage, her body knew it was a lie. He crossed the room, nudged the bathroom door open with his shoulder, and set her down gently, guiding her hands to the sink for balance. "Can you manage?" he asked, and for the first time she heard something entirely new in his voice. Not command, not authority, but concern. She nodded quickly, unable to meet his eyes, and he closed the door, but she could hear him standing just outside, refusing to leave. She moved slowly, painfully, using the wall for support, doing what she needed to do. And when she opened the door, he was still there, waiting. He lifted her again without a word, carried her back to the bed, and lowered her carefully onto the mattress as though she might break apart in his hands. Emma lay there breathing hard while he pulled the blanket up around her, and in the moonlight she could see him watching her with an expression she did not understand. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing this?" Dominic was silent for a long moment before sitting on the edge of the bed, still keeping his distance, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool night air. "You work in my home," he said slowly. "You are one of mine, and I did not protect you. That is my failure." Emma had no words. In 27 years, no one had ever claimed responsibility for any part of her suffering. Her father had vanished without explanation. Her mother had died and left behind debts that swallowed her whole. Noah's accident had happened while she was not there to prevent it. She had always carried the consequences alone, quietly, without complaint. And here was this man, the very man she had spent 14 months avoiding, taking the blame for what had happened to her on a dark street. "Sleep," Dominic said as he rose to his feet. "I will be in the next room. Call if you need anything." Emma closed her eyes, and for the first time in many years, she did not feel entirely alone. Morning arrived with a faint sunlight filtering through the curtains and a soft knock at the door, and Emma opened her eyes, her body still aching but her mind clearer than it had been the night before. Lucia entered with a warm smile, carrying a tray of breakfast, and Dominic's younger sister looked nothing like someone belonging to the underworld, for at 33, with her brown hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck and her gentle brown eyes, dressed in a cashmere sweater and jeans, she appeared simply like a kind woman living a normal life in a normal home. "How are you feeling?" she asked as she set the tray on the table beside the bed. "Sore," Emma admitted quietly, "but better." Lucia nodded and poured her a glass of orange juice, handing it to her with steady hands. "My brother said your younger brother is on his way." Emma almost dropped the glass. "What? Noah? Noah is coming here?" Lucia's expression softened with sympathy. "Dominic sent a car for him early this morning. He thought you would want to see him, and he will be safer here." Emma did not know what to feel. Gratitude at the thought of seeing Noah, fear at the idea of her brother entering this world, anger that Dominic had once again made a decision without asking her, and she had not yet settled on any emotion, when the sound of an engine drifted in from the front drive. Lucia moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside. "They are here." Emma's heart pounded wildly as she tried to sit up, her ribs exploding with pain, and Lucia hurried back to help her, adjusting pillows so she could lean against the headboard. A few minutes later, the soft rolling of wheels echoed from the hallway, and the door swung open. Noah sat there in the wheelchair. Emma had spent 3 months of her salary to buy, his brown curls a tangled mess, his mother's blue eyes wide with worry, and though he was 19, he looked in that moment like a frightened child. "Sis," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Emma." And Emma broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks uncontrollably, tears she had been holding back since last night, since the alley, since waking up in a place that was not her home. She cried from pain, from fear, from relief, from guilt. Noah rolled to the side of the bed and grabbed her hand, crying with her. "They said you were robbed," he stammered through tears. "They said you were hurt. Look at your face. Look at what they did. Who did this to you?" Emma squeezed his hand, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Just some street thieves," she lied, her voice trembling but determined. "They took my bag and my phone and they hit me when I tried to run. It's nothing serious." "Nothing serious?" Noah looked at her swollen face, the bruises around her eye, the split lip, and shook his head. "You broke ribs. The doctor said you broke ribs. You almost died." "I did not die," she whispered, lifting a hand to smooth his hair, though the motion nearly made her faint from pain. "I am still here, and I am going to be fine. Do not worry." From the doorway, standing in the shadowed hall, Dominic watched the siblings in silence. He saw the way Emma lied to shield her brother from a harsher truth, saw the way she fought to be strong although her body was coming apart, saw the way the boy looked at her as if she were his entire world, and he understood why she worked 3 jobs, why she slept 4 hours a night, why she was so thin Marco could lift her as easily as a child. She did not live for herself, she lived for the boy in the wheelchair. "Prepare a room for him on this floor," Dominic told Lucia quietly, "near hers." Lucia nodded without questioning. "And call the family's physical therapist." He glanced at Noah, at the unmoving legs in the chair. "He needs proper care." Lucia looked at her brother with something like astonishment, as though she were seeing something new in the man she had known all her life. "You care about her," she murmured. "She is one of mine," Dominic replied, his voice flat and unreadable. "I take care of my own." Then he turned and walked away, but Lucia noticed the way he looked back at Emma's room once more before disappearing into the dim hallway. 3 days passed in the mansion like a strange dream Emma was not sure she wanted to wake from. Each morning Lucia arrived with breakfast, dishes Emma had only ever seen on cooking shows or in the pages of magazines, plates of eggs Benedict softened beneath warm hollandaise, toast brushed with truffle butter, freshly squeezed orange juice, and rich Italian coffee whose aroma seemed to fill the entire room. Emma tried to refuse, insisting that bread and water were enough, but Lucia only smiled gently and reminded her that she needed real nourishment if she wanted to heal. Between meals and bandage changes, Lucia stayed to talk. She spoke about life inside the mansion, about managing the kitchen, about the Sicilian recipes she had learned from their grandmother, and slowly she began to speak about Dominic. "He was not always like this," Lucia said as she brushed Emma's hair, her touch careful and soothing like that of an older sister. "As a child, he used to laugh all the time, loved books, loved playing the piano. Our father hated it." Emma listened quietly, absorbing every word. "Our father was a hard man," Lucia continued, her voice carrying a quiet ache. "He believed the men in this family were not allowed to be weak. When Dominic was 14, he forced him to witness the first time he dealt with a traitor. Dominic vomited all night, but our father did not allow him to cry. Said tears were a luxury an heir could not afford." Emma thought of the man who had carried her to the bathroom at 3 in the morning. The man who had stood in silence as she and Noah clung to each other and cried, and she wondered where the laughing boy who loved piano had gone inside the man he had become. Every afternoon at exactly 4, like a Swiss clock, Dr. Chen appeared. He examined her injuries, changed her dressings, listened to her heart and lungs, and on the 3rd day declared that her ribs were healing well, the bruises fading, though she still needed at least 10 more days of rest. From the nearby room, Emma heard Noah laughing, a sound she had not heard since before the accident 6 months ago. She dragged herself to the doorway, bracing one hand against the wall as she peered into the hallway. Noah sat in a bright, spacious room, flooded with sunlight, working through physical therapy exercises with a middle-aged blonde woman in medical scrubs, the family's specialist. "Your muscles are responding well," the therapist said as she helped Noah stretch his legs with practiced precision Emma had never seen in any of the free online videos she had relied upon. "If you stay consistent, you may regain some mobility." Emma stood there with tears streaming down her cheeks, not from pain but from the sight of hope returning to her brother's face for the first time in months. But that hope carried a cost she was not sure she could afford. That evening, when Dominic came for his routine check, Emma was sitting upright waiting for him. "I cannot accept all of this," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "The physical therapist, the room for Noah, the food, the medicine. I cannot pay for any of it." Dominic stood in the doorway, the hall light forming a halo behind him so she could not fully see his expression. "Who said you had to pay?" he asked. "I do not take charity," Emma replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "My whole life I have taken care of myself and my family. I do not need anyone's pity." Dominic entered and closed the door behind him, stepping closer until Emma could see the flicker of something like respect in his gray eyes. "You think this is charity," he said slowly. "You were attacked because you work for me, because you wore my family's logo on your chest, and that made you a target. This is not charity. This is responsibility. I do not want you taking responsibility for me," she said. "You do not have a choice," he answered, and the words were not a suggestion. "You will stay here until you are fully healed. Your brother will receive proper care, and you will not pay a single cent, because this is what I am obligated to do, not something you asked for." Then he turned and left, not giving her the chance to argue. Emma stared at the door long after he disappeared, realizing she was dealing with a man who did not know how to hear the word no. And the more frightening truth was that she was no longer sure she wanted to say it. On the 5th day, Emma could finally move around the room without needing to steady herself against the wall, the pain in her ribs still present yet softened now into a dull, lingering ache, rather than the sharp, tearing agony that had ruled her body before, and the bruises on her face had shifted from deep violet to mottled shades of green and gold, the colors of healing. She was sitting by the window, looking down at the garden behind the mansion, when a knock broke the quiet, and she assumed it was Lucia bringing lunch. But the man who entered was Dominic, and he was not alone. Marco Vitale followed him in, the face of the 42-year-old man carved into stillness, though his eyes were as sharp as blades, and Emma sensed instantly that something had happened, the air in the room tightening the way it does before a storm. "We found them," Dominic said without prelude. "The 2 men who attacked you." And Emma felt the blood inside her slow to a crawl. She did not ask how he found them, or where they were now, for she knew his world moved according to rules she did not understand and did not want to understand. "They were men working for Viktor Kozlov," Marco added in his deep, even voice. "Kozlov is the head of the Russian gang in Brooklyn. He is trying to push into Manhattan, and attacking you was his way of sending us a message." Emma swallowed. She was only a house cleaner, a woman who scrubbed floors and folded linens, a woman who had never imagined herself as part of a territory war, yet her body had been used as a canvas for the hatred between dangerous men. Dominic stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her chin upward to meet his gaze, and his gray eyes were not cold today but burning with something dark and volatile. "Do you want to know what happened to them?" he asked, his voice soft as a feather and heavy as lead. Emma looked into his eyes and saw the answer there, buried deep in the storm, colored gray, saw violence, saw blood, saw things no ordinary person should ever see. "No," she whispered, firm despite the tremor in her voice. "I do not want to know." Dominic nodded once, slowly, as though she had passed a test she never asked to take, and he did not seem surprised or disappointed. Perhaps he had known her answer before she gave it. "Good," he said. "There are things you do not need to carry in your mind. But there is one thing you do need to know." He leaned down, his face only inches from hers, and she could smell the faint blend of sandalwood and cigar smoke on his skin, could see the pale scar along his left jaw, as clearly as if it were etched in glass. "They will never touch you again," he said, each word falling with the weight of a sentence passed. "No one will touch you again, not ever." Emma understood without asking. Those men were no longer alive, or if they were, they wished they were not, and she knew she should feel fear, she should feel revulsion. She should want to run from this man and from the violent world he inhabited, but instead she felt something else, something she did not dare name. Safe. For the first time in a very long time, she felt safe. Marco left first, leaving Dominic standing beside her at the window. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked, his gaze turned toward the garden. Emma considered the question for a long moment. "No," she answered truthfully. "I should be, but I am not." Dominic turned to look at her, and in the brief flicker of an instant, she saw something soft move through his gray eyes before it vanished as quickly as if it had never been there at all. On the 7th night, Emma could not sleep, not because of pain, which had eased into a manageable soreness, but because her thoughts kept spiraling through her mind like a relentless storm. She thought of the two men who had attacked her and of what had been done to them. She thought of Dominic and the way his eyes had burned when he promised that no one would ever touch her again. She thought of her life slowly tangling itself with a world she did not belong to. Near midnight she rose from the bed, pulled on the soft sweater Lucia had lent her, and stepped into the hallway. The mansion lay silent like a slumbering castle, moonlight pouring through the tall windows and stretching into pale silver paths across the oak floors. Emma wandered without purpose other than to breathe beyond the four walls of her room. Her feet carried her downstairs, through corridors she had once cleaned every day but had never truly seen, until she noticed a faint glow spilling from the cracked door of the library. She hesitated. She should go back. She should not intrude upon her employer's private sanctuary in the middle of the night, but her feet betrayed her. She pushed the door open. The Castellano library was as large as her entire South Bronx apartment, mahogany shelves reaching to the ceiling, filled with leather-bound books stamped in gold, the fireplace crackling softly in the quiet room. Dominic sat in a leather armchair beside the fire, a glass of whiskey in hand, eyes fixed on the dancing flames. He was not wearing a suit, just an open-collared white shirt, sleeves rolled up, black trousers, and his dark hair fell slightly over his forehead instead of being perfectly slicked back. He looked different, like a man who could not sleep and was drinking alone at midnight simply because the night was too long. "You cannot sleep?" he asked without turning, as if he had known she was standing there the whole time. Emma walked in, her bare feet sinking into the thick Persian rug. "No," she answered softly. "You either." Dominic finally looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his gray eyes, warming them, humanizing them. "I rarely do," he said, gesturing to the armchair across from him. "Sit." Emma curled into the chair, knees drawn up like a small cat, the cushions enveloping her in a comfort she had never known. Dominic rose, poured her a small glass of whiskey, and handed it to her. "Helps with sleep." Emma took the glass and sipped carefully, the rich heat sliding down her throat and spreading through her chest. They sat in silence for a while, both gazing into the flames, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It felt natural, strangely familiar, as though they had done this many times before. "May I ask you something?" Emma said at last, breaking the hush. Dominic tilted his head slightly, inviting her to continue. "Why? Why what? Why are you doing all of this?" Emma set the glass down and turned to face him fully. "I am only a house cleaner, one among dozens of your employees. You did not know my name until last week. So why did you bring me here instead of sending me to a hospital? Why call your private doctor? Why bring my brother here and give him a physical therapist? Why hunt down the men who attacked me and do whatever it is you did to them?" Dominic did not answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding which truth to give her, then set down his drink and leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Because you are mine," he said, his voice low and certain. Emma opened her mouth to object, but he lifted a hand to stop her. You do not understand what that means in my world. Everyone who works for the Castellano family, from the managers to the cleaners, becomes part of this family. They are protected. They are cared for. In return, they are loyal. That is how we operate. That is how we have survived for 3 generations. But I did not ask to be protected, she whispered. No one asks, he replied. It is their right when they belong to this family. And it is my responsibility as the head of it. You were attacked on my territory, wearing my crest. That was not simply an attack on you. It was an attack on me, on everything I represent. If I do not respond, I look weak. And in this world, weakness means death. Emma listened, trying to understand the logic of a life so far removed from her own. So this is about honor, she said quietly. About power. For a moment, something softened in Dominic's eyes. If it were only that, he said slowly, I would have sent you to a hospital with some money for your trouble and forgotten you by morning. But I did not. Have you asked yourself why? Emma did not answer. She did not know the answer, and she feared that if she asked, it would change everything. Then why? She whispered. Dominic looked at her for a very long time. Because I do not know, he said at last. And for the first time, Emma heard uncertainty in the voice of the man who controlled everything. Because there is something about you that I cannot look away from anymore. That night, after their conversation in the library, Emma returned to her room with her mind spinning, Dominic's words echoing through her like a bell that would not stop ringing. There is something about you that I cannot look away from. What did that mean? Who was she? A woman who scrubbed floors and folded sheets, that a man like Dominic Castellano should be unable to look away. She drifted into sleep with questions swirling like smoke, and that was when the nightmare began. She stood again in the dark alley. The rain was falling hard, cold enough to pierce through skin, soaking her to the bone. 2 figures stepped out of the shadows, and this time she could see their faces clearly. The bald one with the snake tattoo grinning at her with a warped, devilish smile. You work for Castellano, he said, his voice echoing as though it came from inside a cavern. Kozlov will enjoy this. She tried to run, but her legs would not move. She tried to scream, but her throat locked tight. The first punch came, then the second, then the third, pain exploding through her body, and this time there was no one coming to save her. She lay on the wet pavement, blood stinging her eyes as one of the men lifted his boot to crush her skull. Emma screamed. The sound tore through the night, through the room, through the hallway, perhaps through the entire mansion. She bolted upright on the bed, drenched in sweat, heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst, her limbs trembling uncontrollably. The door flew open. Dominic stormed in like a force of nature, his eyes wild as they swept the room for danger. He wore only sleep pants and a shirt hastily buttoned, barefoot on the wooden floor, dark hair falling across his forehead. When he saw she was alone, curled in on herself, he stopped, drew in a breath, and approached her slowly. Emma, he said, his voice soft and careful, as though speaking to a frightened animal. Emma, you are safe. You are here. You are safe. But she could not hear him. She was still in the alley, still taking the blows, still feeling the terror ripping through her. She shook uncontrollably, teeth chattering, tears streaming down her cheeks without her even noticing. Dominic sat on the edge of the bed. He did not ask if she was all right or offer empty comfort. He simply took her hand. His hand was large and warm, enclosing her cold fingers completely. He held on, firmly enough for her to feel him, firmly enough to anchor her. Emma, he said again, closer this time, warmer. Look at me. Slowly, she turned her head until her eyes met his in the darkness. His gray eyes were not cold now. They were watching her with something she did not dare name. You are here, he said, each word steady and deliberate. In my home, safe. No one can touch you here, no one. His voice was low and even, like waves beating softly against a shore, pulling her back from the nightmare. Emma breathed deeply, once, twice, 3 times. Her trembling eased little by little. Her heart began to slow. Tears still fell, but the panic loosened its grip. She did not know how long they stayed like that. Minutes or hours. Dominic did not let go of her hand, did not leave, did not show impatience or discomfort. He simply sat at her side in the dark, his shoulder touching hers, holding her hand until her breathing steadied. I am sorry, she whispered, her voice raw. I woke you. You do not need to apologize, he replied, shifting to lean back against the headboard beside her. Do you want to talk about it? No. Good. Sometimes silence is the best. They sat there in quiet, shoulder to shoulder, staring into the darkness. Emma felt the warmth radiating from his body, felt the calm of his steady breathing, felt the immovable presence of him beside her. And for the first time in many years, she felt safe, not the borrowed safety of a locked apartment door, but a real, solid, unshakable safety, the kind that came from being beside a man who would burn the world to the ground if anyone dared lay a hand on her. 10 days passed, and the bruises on Emma's face had nearly vanished, leaving only a faint yellow tint beneath her left eye if one looked closely, and although her ribs still ached when she moved too quickly, she could walk on her own again, shower by herself, and dress without help. Yet the same 10 days had gone by without her earning a single dollar, 10 days without her usual shifts at the bar, 10 days without the weekend office cleaning job, 10 days during which the bills continued to pile up in her empty South Bronx apartment. She knew because she had asked Lucia to check her mailbox, and the news had not been kind. Electricity, water, rent, the monthly payment on her medical debt, numbers climbing steadily while her income remained at zero. That morning, Emma sought Dominic in his office. He sat behind a massive oak desk, surrounded by stacks of documents, his phone wedged between his shoulder and ear as he spoke in rapid Italian to someone on the other end. When he saw her in the doorway, he gestured for her to wait, finished the call, and set the phone aside. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need to go back to work," Emma said plainly. Dominic looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable. "No," he said, short and final, and turned back to his paperwork as though the conversation had ended. But Emma did not move. She stepped into the room and stood before his desk, arms crossed. "You cannot say no without explaining." "I just did," he replied. "That is explanation enough." "No, it is not." Emma felt the anger she had been swallowing for 10 days rising in her chest. "I have my own life, Mr. Castellano. I have bills to pay. I have $118,000 in medical debt collecting interest every day. I cannot lie in this place doing nothing while everything out there falls apart." Dominic lifted his head, his eyes darkening. "You think I am keeping you here to do nothing?" "I do not know why you are keeping me here," she shot back, stepping closer. "I only know I cannot keep living like this. I need to work. I need to earn money. I need to feel useful instead of lying here like some wounded bird waiting for someone to pity me." Dominic rose from behind the desk, came around it, and stood before her. He was nearly a head taller, close enough that she had to lift her chin to meet his gaze. "You are not fully recovered," he said, voice tight with restraint. "Dr. Chen says you need another week." "Doctor Chen is not the one staring at a pile of overdue bills," Emma answered, refusing to step back. "You do not understand. You do not understand what it feels like when every passing day is another day sinking deeper into debt. You do not understand what it is like to have a brother waiting at home, believing his sister will take care of everything, while that sister is trapped here like a bird in a gilded cage owned by a mafia boss." Something flickered in Dominic's eyes. "You think this is a cage?" "I do not know what it is," she said, her voice trembling with anger and something else she did not want to name. "I only know that I am not used to sitting still while someone else handles my life. I have taken care of myself my whole life. I took care of my mother when she was sick. I took care of Noah after the accident. I do not know how to be cared for. And honestly, I do not want to learn." They stood there facing one another. The air between them stretched tight. Emma saw his jaw clench, saw the muscle in his temple pulse as though he were holding back words or temper or both. Then he exhaled, a long breath that sounded like surrender. "Fine," he said, and Emma almost thought she had misheard. "You want to work? Fine. But there are conditions." "What conditions?" "You work only in this mansion. No bar shifts, no late-night office cleaning, no wandering the streets alone after dark. You work here, for me, and I will pay you triple your current wages to make up for the jobs you are leaving." "Triple?" Emma stared at him. "I do not need your charity." "This is not charity," Dominic said, stepping closer until she could feel the heat of him. "This is an arrangement. You work for me, only me, and I pay you fairly. You get to work as you wish, and I know you are safe. Both sides benefit." Emma searched his face, trying to find even a trace of pity in those gray eyes, but she found none. Only determination, and perhaps, buried carefully beneath everything else, a sliver of worry he did not want her to see. "Why do you care whether I am safe?" she whispered. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, then turned away and walked back behind his desk. "You start tomorrow," he said, deliberately ignoring her question. "Lucia will arrange your schedule," and Emma knew that was all the answer she would get. at least for today. Emma began working again the next day, exactly as Dominic had said, but everything was different. Before, she had moved through the mansion like a ghost, silent and invisible, arranging her schedule around his so she would never have to cross his path. She had known when he held meetings, when he left the house, when he returned, and she had timed her cleaning so precisely that weeks could pass without them exchanging a single word. That was no longer possible. On her first day back, she entered Dominic's office at 2 p.m, just as Lucia had arranged. She knocked, waited for permission, then stepped inside with her cleaning cart. Dominic sat behind his desk, reading a thick stack of documents. She expected him to leave the room, to give her space as he always had before, but he did not. He merely lifted his head, nodded a brief greeting, and returned to his work. Emma hesitated for a second, then began cleaning. She dusted the shelves, careful not to disturb any of the meticulously arranged objects, and tried not to notice the man sitting only a few feet away. But it was impossible to ignore the moments when she felt his gaze drift from the papers to her, steady and unreadable. She was polishing a bronze statue when his voice broke the quiet. "Do you like reading?" Emma turned, surprised. It was the first time he had initiated conversation while she was working. "I do," she answered, "when I had time to read. What kind of books? Anything I could get my hands on." She resumed wiping the statue, but the conversation did not end. Mostly classic novels. "My mother loved Austen, so I grew up with Austen." Dominic nodded and set his pen down. "I prefer Dostoevsky." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Crime and Punishment." He almost smiled. A small, fleeting curve of the lips so quick she wasn't sure she had seen it. "You think that means something, do you not? A mafia boss who likes a book about crime and redemption." Emma felt her cheeks warm. "I did not say that. You did not need to." Dominic walked to the bookshelf and pulled out an old leather-bound volume. "But you are right. I read it for the first time when I was 16, after my father made me do something I would rather forget. I was looking for something then. Maybe absolution. Maybe an explanation for the world I had been forced to live in." Emma froze, watching him. He stood there with his back to her, holding the worn book, and for a moment he did not look like the feared Mafia king whose name kept half the city awake at night. He looked like a man with a heavy past, searching for a way to live with the weight of it. "What was your mother like?" Emma asked softly. Dominic was silent for a long time before he turned, returning the book to its shelf. "My mother was the gentlest woman I have ever known. She died when I was 12. Cancer. My father never recovered, and he took that pain out on me and Lucia. He said she died because she was weak, and that his children would not be allowed to be weak." Emma felt her heart tighten. "My mother died of cancer too," she whispered. 3 years ago. Lung cancer." Dominic looked at her then, his gray eyes softening. "I know. I read your file." Emma was not surprised. Of course he had. That was how his world worked. "She taught me to read," Emma continued, unsure why she was sharing so much but unable to stop. "When she got sick, I read to her every night. Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Jane Eyre. She loved stories about strong women surviving impossible odds. Maybe she hoped I would become one." "You did become one," Dominic said quietly, making Emma look up. "You worked 3 jobs to raise your brother. You carry $118,000 of debt and have not broken under it. You were beaten nearly to death and stood up 10 days later demanding to work again. If that is not strong, I do not know what is." Emma could not speak. She stood there with a cloth in her hand, staring at the man looking at her as though she were something rare and valuable. "And Noah," Dominic said, breaking the silence. "What was he like before the accident?" Emma smiled for the first time in days. "Noah was the light of our family. Brilliant, funny, absurdly optimistic. He was accepted to Columbia on a full scholarship. He was going to be a lawyer. Then that truck hit him." Her voice faltered, and everything changed. Dominic stepped closer. He lifted a hand, hesitated for a breath, then rested it gently on her shoulder. "Both of us carry scars," he said, his voice low. "Yours live in the debt you shoulder and the legs your brother cannot move. Mine live in the things my father forced on me and the things I became because of them. But scars do not define us. How we live with them does." Emma looked up, met his eyes, and in that moment she understood something she had not wanted to admit. Somewhere in the past weeks, he had stopped being the terrifying man she avoided. He had become something else, something she did not dare to name. 3 weeks had passed since the night Emma was attacked in that dark alley. 3 weeks of living inside the Castellano mansion, working under Dominic's protection, eating the nutritious meals Lucia prepared, and sleeping full nights on a bed softer than anything she had ever owned. And Noah noticed the difference. He sat in his wheelchair in his room, watching his sister enter with his dinner tray. Emma looked different. Not just because the bruises had faded or because she no longer winced each time she moved. Something deeper had shifted. Her eyes were brighter, no longer dulled beneath dark circles. Her skin had color again, instead of the paper-pale exhaustion she had worn for months, and she smiled more often. Real smiles that reached her eyes, not the forced ones he had grown used to since the accident. Even the way she spoke about her employer had changed. "Sis," Noah said as she set the tray on the table beside his bed. "Sit down. We need to talk." Emma turned, noticing the seriousness etched into her brother's face, a look rare for a boy who had always tried to protect her spirit with humor. She sat on the edge of the bed, facing him. "What is it?" "Tell me the truth," Noah said, his blue eyes steady on hers. "What is going on between you and Dominic Castellano?" Emma felt her heartbeat stutter. "I do not know what you mean. Do not lie to me." Noah leaned forward as far as the chair allowed, his voice not angry but resolute. "I may be in a wheelchair, but I am not blind. I see the way he looks at you whenever he passes in the hall. I see the way you blush whenever someone mentions his name. I heard Lucia telling Dr. Chen that he does not leave his office anymore when you clean it. You think I do not notice?" Emma lowered her head, her hands twisting together in her lap. She had no idea how to explain something she herself barely understood. "I do not know what is happening," she admitted softly. "I truly do not. I only know that he is not what I thought he was. He cares about me, about you, in a way no one has cared for us since Mom died. He is Mafia, Emma." Noah's voice tightened. "He is a crime boss. He kills people. I know that," she said quietly. "You know that. And I am still here. I am not proud of it. I am not pretending this is ideal. But Noah, my whole life I have tried to do the right thing. I worked 3 jobs. I slept 4 hours a night. I lived on leftover food and coffee. And did anyone help me? Did anyone show up for us? No. No one. Until him." Noah said nothing for a long moment, his face a tangle of emotions. He wanted to hate Dominic Castellano. He wanted to pull his sister out of this dangerous world. But he also saw the truth in front of him, a truth he could not ignore. For the first time in years, his sister did not look like she was about to collapse. "Are you safe?" he asked finally, his voice small. "That is all I need to know. Are you safe with him?" Emma thought of his question. Thought of the night Dominic held her through a nightmare, of the way he had stood guard in the dark without asking for anything, of the promise that no one would ever touch her again, and the way he had kept that promise. "Noah," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "I have been afraid for so many years, afraid of bills I could not pay, afraid I would fail you, afraid that one day I would fall and not get back up. But here, with him, I am not afraid anymore. I have never felt safer than I do now." Noah looked at her, reading the sincerity in her eyes. Then he exhaled and squeezed her hand with his good one. "All right," he said. "I believe you. But promise me something. If anything goes wrong, if anything scares you, if anything feels off, you tell me. Promise." Emma nodded, and she knew that even if she was stepping into a world she had never belonged to, she was no longer stepping into it alone. That night, everything changed. As Emma sat in the library reading while Dominic's phone rang again and again from his office next door, his voice at first steady and calm until it sharpened into something cold as steel, and though she could not make out every word, she heard Kozlov's name repeated several times before the rush of footsteps, the slam of a door, and the sound of a car speeding away into the night. She could not sleep. Lying on her bed, staring wide-eyed at the ceiling with a pulse that would not settle, sensing with every nerve in her body that something terrible was unfolding somewhere beyond the walls of the mansion, and at 3 a.m. she heard the car return, the engine cut, the door close, the heavy steps crunching over gravel, and she rose from bed, pulled on her robe, and stepped into the hall where from the staircase she saw Dominic enter the main foyer and stopped in absolute shock, for there was blood on his shirt, blood on his hands, blood dried black along his collar and sleeves like dark ink stains on white fabric, and though his face held no expression, his gray eyes were hollow in a way that made him look like a man whose soul had slipped from his body, leaving only a shell behind, while Marco followed with a pale, intense face and said he would call Dr. Chen, to which Dominic replied in a low and exhausted voice that it was not his blood. Emma should have been afraid. She knew that. She should have returned to her room, closed the door, pretended she had seen nothing, because an ordinary person would have done exactly that. A wise person would have done exactly that. but her feet refused to obey, and instead carried her down the stairs step by step until she stood before Dominic close enough to smell the metallic tang of blood and the faint smoke of gunfire on him. And Marco, sensing the moment, quietly slipped away, leaving the two of them standing alone under the soft golden lights of the foyer, like actors on a stage at 3 a.m, as Emma searched his eyes for something she could not name, and finally whispered, "Are you all right?" And Dominic stared at her as if she had spoken a language he had never heard before, repeating her question in disbelief that she could look at him in such a state and ask if he was all right. And when she did not answer, when she simply waited, he finally spoke, saying that Kozlov had attacked one of his operations that night in retaliation for the 2 men he had taken care of, and he looked down at his hands, at the dried blood staining his skin, and said that 2 of his men were dead, 2 men with families and small children who had died in a war they had not chosen. Emma felt a tightening in her chest, not from fear but from sorrow for the dead and for the man in front of her who carried their weight on his shoulders, and she whispered that she was sorry, though she knew no other words to offer. And Dominic let out a harsh, humorless laugh as he asked if she understood what he had done that night, if she understood how many he had killed in return, and yet she stood there saying she was sorry, so she stepped closer, close enough to touch him if she wished, and told him that she knew who he was, knew what he did, that she was not naive, but she also knew that he had no choice, because in his world if he did not strike back he would die and his people would die and perhaps she would die as well. And Dominic looked at her while the emptiness in his eyes slowly cracked, as he asked why she did not run, why she did not flee like any other woman would when faced with him like this, why she remained, and Emma thought of all the reasons she should fear him, should flee him, should turn her back on this violent world of his, and then she thought of the night he held her hand through her nightmare, of the way he looked at her as if she were something precious, of the safety she felt only when he was near, and she said softly that she was not like any other woman, and that whether he believed it or not she cared about whether he was all right. And Dominic stood there with blood on his hands, staring at her as if she had just handed him something he had not known he needed until the moment it appeared in front of him. In the days that followed that bloody night, the Castellano mansion became a fortress, every entrance tightly monitored, Marco and his men stationed on alert 24 hours a day, Emma and Noah forbidden from leaving the grounds while Dominic disappeared into closed-door meetings that stretched for hours, tense phone calls, and midnight trips he never explained, and Emma could see exhaustion eating away at him, the shadows beneath his eyes darkening, his jaw clenched as if he carried the weight of the entire world on his shoulders, eating less, sleeping less, a truth she knew because she brought meals to his office and found them nearly untouched each time she returned to collect the trays. On the afternoon of the 5th day after the attack, she stood outside his door, listening to the voices of the men inside, sharp and tense, rising and falling like the growl of dangerous animals, and she waited 10 minutes, then 20, then 30, until the door finally opened and a group of men filed out, glancing at her only briefly before heading down the stairs in silence, and after a few breaths she knocked, hearing his weary voice telling her to come in as she entered with a tray of Earl Grey tea, the kind he preferred because she had quietly observed him for weeks, and she found the office littered with documents and an ashtray overflowing with cigarettes, while Dominic sat with his head in his hands, looking like a man at the final edge of endurance. He did not look up when she set the tray down, so she poured a cup of tea, placed it before him, and turned to leave when his hand closed around her wrist, stopping her in place with a grip firm enough to hold her yet not enough to hurt, and when she turned back, she saw his long, strong fingers wrapped around her skin as he whispered, "Do not go," in a voice that no longer carried the cold authority she knew, but something frayed, wounded, and perhaps unbearably lonely. She did not go, standing quietly as he lifted his head and looked at her with an intensity she had never seen in his gray eyes before, asking why she was still here, and when she said because he had told her not to go, he shook his head, rose without releasing her, and came around the desk until he stood in front of her, asking in a voice barely above a whisper, why she remained in this house after everything she had seen, why she had not resigned and run far away, and when she asked if he wanted her to run, he said he wanted to understand, lifting his other hand to her face, touching her cheek as if she were something fragile, asking why she was not afraid of him, why everyone feared him except her, why she had seen him covered in blood and stepped toward him instead of away, why she could see the violence in his eyes and still be here, bringing him tea as if he were an ordinary man worn out after a long day. She felt the warmth of his palm against her skin and the wild thrum of her heartbeat, knowing she should lie, should claim fear, should protect herself the way any sensible woman would, but she was too tired of lies, too tired of pretending, and she said the truth, that he had never frightened her, not from the first night he carried her from Marco's car, not from the night he helped her to the bathroom at 3 a.m, not when he held her hand through a nightmare, that she feared many things in her life, the debt she could not pay, the possibility that Noah might never walk again, the day she would collapse and not rise, but him, she whispered, him she had never feared, and Dominic looked at her as something cracked open in his eyes. The walls he had spent a lifetime building, the armor he wore against the world all splintering before her. He told her she should fear him, that he was a monster, that he had done terrible things, that his hands were stained with more blood than he could ever wash away, and she answered that monsters did not tremble from exhaustion instead of sleeping, monsters did not carry the deaths of 2 men as if they were personal failings, monsters did not protect a housekeeper whose name they had not even known simply because she had been beaten on their territory, and Dominic said nothing as he looked at her as though she were something impossible and fragile and real. Then he leaned down slowly enough for her to step back if she wished. But she did not move, lifting her face to him as his mouth met hers in a kiss that was not gentle and not sweet, but rough and desperate, the kiss of a drowning man reaching for the last breath he could find, his arms sliding around her waist, pulling her tight against him. And she felt the hunger in the way he kissed her, the loneliness in the way he held her as if he feared she would disappear, and she answered him, her arms rising around his neck, her fingers slipping into his dark hair, kissing him back as though it were something she had been waiting her whole life to feel without ever knowing it. They pulled apart, both of them breathing hard, Emma feeling her lips tingling and her heart pounding as if it might burst from her chest, her body trembling not from fear but from something far stronger, and Dominic stepped back one pace, then another, the distance between them opening like a sudden chasm, as he said in a rough, unsteady voice that this should not have happened, rubbing his face as if trying to wake from a dream, while Emma stood there with her mouth still warm from his kiss, feeling as though cold water had been thrown over her, wanting to ask why and what he regretted but saying nothing, simply waiting as she had been waiting for weeks. She is my employee, Dominic continued with his back turned as he stared out the window as if he could not face her, saying she was hurt because of him, she was here because he had brought her here, and this, he said with a breath drawn deep into his lungs, felt as though he were taking advantage of the situation, which made Emma let out a small, humorless laugh, as she asked if he truly believed he was exploiting her, and he said he believed he was doing what a man in power should never do with a woman who depended on him. And when he turned his conflicted gray eyes toward her, he said she had nowhere else to go. Her brother was here, she needed this job, and if anything went wrong, she would lose everything, and he could not put her in that position. Emma stepped toward him, closing the space he had created until she was close enough to see the faint scar along his jaw, and the way his pupils widened when he looked at her, and she asked him how old he was, startling him into blinking before he said 37. And when she asked how long he had led this empire, he said 12 years since his father died, and she told him that in those 5 years he had made thousands of decisions that changed the lives of hundreds, decisions of life and death, decisions worth millions. And if he was old enough for all of that, then he should not think she was too young to know what she wanted. He did not answer, only looked at her with a struggle written plainly in his eyes between what he wanted and what he believed was right, as she told him she was 27, that she had cared for her sick mother for 18 months, had buried her and inherited $73,000 of debt, had watched her brother lose the ability to walk and still risen every morning to work 3 jobs, that she was not some naive girl who needed protection from her own choices. And if she stood here and kissed him back, it was because she chose to, not because she lacked options. Dominic lifted a hand to her face, his fingers trembling slightly as though he were holding back something immense, and he whispered that she did not understand the kind of man he was, that he was not good, that he had done things she could not imagine, that he had enemies who wanted him dead and would kill anyone close to him, that if she stayed with him she would never have a normal life but would live in shadows and danger in a world that was not hers. And Emma placed her hand on his chest, feeling the strong, urgent rhythm beneath his shirt, as she said she knew exactly who he was and what he did, that she had seen him walk into the house with blood on his hands, heard his midnight calls, understood perfectly how dangerous his world was, and still she was here. Not because she had no choice, but because this was her choice. Dominic studied her for a long time, searching for fear or hesitation and finding none, and he said she would regret this, and she answered that perhaps she would, but the regret would be hers, not his. And then, as if the last wall inside him crumbled, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her again, this time not with desperation but with slow depth, a quiet promise unfolding between them. In the weeks that followed, They lived two parallel lives. For during the day, Emma was still the housekeeper of the Castellano mansion, pushing her cleaning cart through the hallways, wiping marble surfaces, replacing the flowers in vases, folding towels in the bathrooms. And when she passed Dominic in the corridor, she lowered her head in polite greeting like any other employee, while he returned the gesture with a neutral expression, as though she were simply one among dozens who worked under him. And no one suspected that each night, when the mansion fell into sleep and darkness draped the long halls, Emma slipped quietly from her room and walked to the door at the end of the third-floor hall, where Dominic's bedroom lay, a door she never knocked on because she never needed to, for it always opened at the slightest push, as though he had been waiting for her. He was usually seated in the dark beside the window, overlooking the glittering lights of Manhattan, a glass of whiskey in hand, and when she entered, he said nothing, only opened his arms for her, and Emma went into them as though that were the place she had always belonged, and they talked for hours about great things and small ones, as she told him about her childhood, about the tiny apartment in Queens where she grew up, about the smell of the apple pies her mother baked every Sunday, about the day her father left without a single word when she was 12, and about the phone call from the hospital announcing that her mother had been diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer, about the nights she sat beside the hospital bed reading to her, and the final smile her mother gave before she closed her eyes forever. And Dominic listened to everything without interrupting, without offering empty comforts, simply holding her hand as though her stories were the most important thing he had ever heard. And then he spoke too, telling her about his father, Antonio Castellano, the man who built this empire from the blood and tears of others, telling her about the lessons forced upon him from the age of 10, lessons about power and cruelty and never allowing anyone to see weakness, telling her about the first night he had to kill, at 18, when his father placed a gun in his hand and said it was the only way to become a man in their family, telling her about the nightmares that still visited him, the faces of those he had killed appearing in his dreams, and the guilt he never allowed himself to show before anyone. And Emma listened without judgment or fear, simply holding his hand tighter. They learned each other through the smallest things, for Emma discovered that Dominic liked black coffee without sugar in the morning but preferred Earl Grey with a touch of honey at night, that he hated the scent of lilies because they reminded him of his mother's funeral, that he read before sleeping and always read Russian classics, folding the corner of the page instead of using a bookmark, while Dominic learned that Emma bit her lip when she thought, twisted her fingers when she worried, and sang softly to Taylor Swift songs when she believed no one could hear, that she liked cold pizza for breakfast, hated chilies but loved wasabi, and always read the last page of a book before beginning it. And during these nights, Dominic slept more easily, something Emma noticed in the second week when she woke at 4 a.m. to find him still asleep, his face peaceful in a way she had never seen, the dark circles beneath his eyes lighter, his jaw no longer tensed, his whole demeanor younger and unburdened, as though her presence removed part of the weight he had carried for so many years. And Emma changed as well, for the first time in many years she no longer dreamed of that dark alley, no longer felt fear settling over her when night came, because she knew that no matter how dangerous the world outside might be, there was a man willing to burn it all down to keep her safe, and she was lying in his arms every night. That morning Emma sat on her bed, with the old laptop Lucia had lent her open across her knees, doing what she always did on the first day of every month, as she checked her bank account and her debts to calculate how much she still owed, how many more years she would have to pay, how much longer she would have to live under the crushing shadow of those numbers, and she logged into the financial company's website, where her $73,000 medical debt from her mother's hospital bills was being repaid with a predatory interest rate, bracing herself to see the total that had haunted her for 3 years. But when the page finished loading, her heart stopped. Outstanding balance, 0. And she blinked, checked again, refreshed the page, but the number stayed the same, and the line beneath it read that the loan had been paid in full on the 15th of December, and her hands trembled as she switched to the site where Noah's $45,000 treatment and physical therapy debt waited, only to see again that the outstanding balance was 0, paid in full on the 15th of December, and when she checked her own bank account, nothing had changed. No large withdrawals, which meant someone else had paid the debt. Someone had paid $118,000 without saying a word, and Emma knew exactly who that someone was. She closed the laptop, stood, and walked out of her room on shaking legs, moving down the hall, down the stairs, across the foyer, toward Dominic's office. And she did not knock. She pushed the door open without caring who might be inside, but he was alone reading documents and looked up at her with the calm of a man who had been expecting this moment. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice trembling with something she could not name, and he told her she needed to be more specific, as he set the papers aside and leaned back in his chair, and she stepped closer saying, "The debt, $118,000. You paid it? You did not ask me? You did not tell me? You just did it?" And he answered simply, "Yes," without a hint of remorse. And when she asked why, tears streaming down her cheeks despite her hatred of crying, he said because he could, because he wanted to, because she deserved to live without that weight on her back. She told him she had not asked for this. She did not need him to save her. She was not a wounded bird in need of care, and he told her she was not, wiping her tears as he said she was the strongest woman he had ever met, that she had carried $118,000 of debt and still stood tall, that she worked 3 jobs and did not break, that she cared for her brother and still somehow found the strength to care for him, that she did not need saving, but that did not mean she had to do everything alone. She said she did not want to owe him, did not want to feel like she was there because of his money, and he asked if she truly believed he had done this to buy her, if she thought he paid $118,000 to keep her beside him, and when she whispered that she did not know what to think, he stepped forward, gripping her shoulders and forcing her to meet his eyes, as he said clearly that he had not done it to purchase her, but because he could not stand watching her exhausted every day, could not bear knowing she counted every dollar while he had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. And he did it because she belonged to him now, not as an object to possess, but as someone he would protect, would care for, would make sure never carried the weight alone again, because that was how he loved, and how he cared for what was his. And as Emma looked at him with tears still flowing but no longer from anger, perhaps from relief or gratitude or something deeper she was not yet ready to name, she whispered that she did not know what to say, and he told her she did not need to say anything, pulling her into his arms and holding her as if she were the most precious thing in his world, telling her she only needed to stay, to be with him, because that was all he needed. And Emma buried her face in his chest and cried because for the first time in 3 years, she no longer carried the weight of $118,000, cried because for the first time in her life someone loved her enough to carry the burden with her, and cried because she knew that no matter how she might try to resist, she already belonged entirely to this man. And the most frightening part was that she did not want it to be any other way. The message arrived on an ordinary morning while Emma was drinking coffee with Noah in the dining room, a plain envelope with no stamp and no return address, left at the front gate as if someone had placed it there in the middle of the night without anyone noticing. And Marco brought it to Dominic's office, where Emma saw the color drain from his face as he opened it, revealing a single photograph, a picture of her, captured as she walked from the back door of the estate into the garden, with her hair lifted by the wind and a smile softening her mouth. A photograph taken from far away through the fence with a professional telephoto lens, and on the back of it was a handwritten line in Russian that Marco translated in a trembling voice. "A beautiful girl. It would be such a shame if something happened to her," signed Kozlov. Dominic did not tell Emma about the picture. He hid it, held closed-door meetings with Marco and his most trusted men, spent hours locked in his office. But Emma sensed something was wrong as the number of guards doubled, as Marco shadowed her everywhere she went, as Dominic watched her with a worry he could not fully hide, until she confronted him that night in his bedroom, where he stood by the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand, asking what he was hiding from her, and though he said there was nothing she needed to worry about, she stepped closer and insisted he stop lying, demanded the truth, and after a long silence he sighed, set his whiskey down, and handed her the photograph. And as she looked at it, she felt her blood slow, recognizing herself in that image, realizing someone had been watching her inside the very grounds she believed were safest. "Kozlov knows about you," Dominic said heavily. "He sent this as a threat." And when she asked what he wanted, Dominic answered that he wanted war, or he wanted him to bow. 2 choices, all-out conflict, meaning blood in the streets, meaning many would die, meaning she would become a primary target, or negotiation, meaning he would have to sit down with his enemy, surrender territory, accept humiliation in front of everyone watching. And when she asked which he would choose, he looked at her for a long moment, before lifting his hand to her cheek and admitting that for 12 years in this world he had never backed down, that his father had taught him that yielding was weakness, and weakness meant death, that he had lived by that rule, killed for that rule, built his empire by that rule. And she waited with her heart racing until he said that now, for the first time in 12 years, he had something more important than the empire, more important than power, more important than never bending. And he lowered his forehead to hers, as he whispered that he would negotiate, that he would meet with Kozlov and try to end this without war. not because he feared the man, but because he could not bear the thought of her being hurt again. And when she begged him not to sacrifice his empire for her, he told her it was not a sacrifice but a choice, a priority, that she had shown him there were things more important than winning every battle. Then he stepped back, looked into her eyes, and said that tomorrow he would meet Kozlov and negotiate a peace, and when he returned he wanted her here, safe, waiting for him, and Emma could only nod with tears running down her cheeks as she wrapped her arms around the man who was willing to place her above the empire he had spent a lifetime building. Dominic returned at 4 a.m, and Emma had not slept at all, sitting in the library through the long night with her eyes fixed on the door and her heart lurching at every sound. And when the familiar engine stopped at the gate, she ran to the grand foyer without caring who might see her or what secret they had guarded for weeks, only to find Dominic stepping inside whole and uninjured. No blood, no wounds, only exhaustion etched into his face, and something else in his gray eyes, something that looked like relief, like a long-awaited peace. And he said, quietly enough for her to hear, "It is done. The agreement is signed. Kozlov will withdraw from Manhattan, and in return I ceded part of Brooklyn. The war is over." And Emma said nothing, only threw herself into his arms and held him as though he might vanish if she let go, while he folded her against him with his face buried in her hair, the two of them standing in the soft gold light of the Castellano foyer, like survivors who had found each other in the ruins. After a long moment he said, "Come with me, there is somewhere I want to show you," and he led her up the stairs, through familiar halls, to a door on the 4th floor she had never opened, the door leading to the rooftop terrace where she stepped out into the cold dawn air, and drew a breath as the entire sweep of Manhattan unfurled before her like a shimmering tapestry of light, skyscrapers rising into the fading night, streets glowing like ribbons, and the eastern horizon shifting from black to violet to rose to amber as the sun prepared to rise. "This is where I stand every morning," Dominic said beside her, looking out over the city, "over the empire my grandfather began, my father built, and I have spent 12 years holding together. Power, territory, responsibility for 200 families whose survival depends on my decisions." And then he turned to her. "But since you came, each morning I stand here, and I no longer see an empire. I see the city where you live, the streets you walk, the world I want to keep safe, not for power but because you are in it." And Emma felt her heart tighten as the first light of dawn touched them, gilding her hair and softening the hard lines of his face, and Dominic lifted his hand to her cheek, tracing the curve of her bone where bruises had bloomed 6 weeks earlier, and he said, "I love you," the words falling heavy and luminous like stones made of light. "I love you not because you are beautiful, though you are, not because you make me want to be better, though you do. I love you because you look into the darkness in me and do not run. Because all my life people have feared me. My men fear me. My enemies fear me. Even Lucia fears me sometimes when she sees what I am capable of. But you saw me walk into the house with blood on my hands and you asked whether I was all right. You know who I am, know what I do, and you are still here. Still let me touch you. Still sleep in my arms every night. You have given me what no one ever has, complete acceptance without judgment or condition," and tears slipped down Emma's face even as she smiled through them, telling him she loved him too. Loved him though he was complicated and dangerous and did things she never wanted to know the details of. Loved him because beneath all the coldness and the power there was a man who held her hand through nightmares, who wept in his sleep for the men he had lost, who was willing to sit with his enemy to keep her safe, and she placed her hand on his chest, feeling the strong rhythm beneath her palm, and told him that while he spoke of the darkness inside him she carried her own, the darkness of losing her mother, of watching her brother lose the ability to walk, of drowning under debts and exhaustion and despair, and he had looked into that darkness and had not turned away, had steadied her, lifted her, shown her she did not have to be strong alone, and Dominic kissed her, gently, deeply, not with desperation as in their first kisses, but with peace, with certainty, with the quiet weight of a promise not spoken aloud. And when they parted, the sun had risen fully over the horizon, bathing Manhattan in gold, and Emma leaned against his chest with his arms wrapped around her, and for the first time in years, she was not thinking about debts or work or burdens she had carried for too long, for all of it had been lifted from her shoulders, the $118,000 debt gone, Noah receiving the best care and slowly healing, and she was standing in the arms of a man who loved her enough to place her above the empire he had spent a lifetime protecting. Her life would never be normal. She knew that she would live in a world of shadows and violence, of silent wars and watching enemies, but she would not live it alone, for she was no longer merely surviving, She was beginning to live, truly live, and when Dominic asked if she was ready to face the new day, she looked up into the warm gray eyes she had never seen so unguarded, and said with him always. Their story reminds us that love can bloom in the darkest corners, and that those who seem the coldest on the surface may be the ones who love the deepest, that life rarely gives us perfect circumstances, but how we face adversity defines who we are, that Emma did not crumble under debt and loss, that Dominic did not allow a brutal past to turn him into a monster entirely, that they found each other, healed each other, and built a beginning from the wreckage. The lesson is never judge a person by their surface, and never abandon hope, even when life feels unbearably heavy, for sometimes the light comes from the places we least expect. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and tap the notification bell so you never miss another moving story like this. And a single like or share from you will help this story reach more people, carrying its message of love, hope, and resilience. How did this story make you feel? And in real life, do you believe love can change people? Have you ever met someone who saw your imperfections and stayed anyway? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear the truth that lives in your heart. Thank you for staying with this story from beginning to end. Wishing each of you watching this video good health, joy, and gentle peace in every day. And remember that no matter how hard life becomes, there is always light waiting at the end of the tunnel. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.